So welcome back to Miss Diaz's Getting Ready for 5th Grade videos. And so what I want you guys to remember from the first video is that, remember, we learned how to add and subtract fractions using common denominators. The denominators were the same, so all we had to do was keep the denominator and add and subtract the numerators. But here, we're adding and subtracting related fractions. So this is a little easier than what you're actually going to be doing in 5th grade, but this is the first step, okay? Now, these denominators are related, meaning that they're in groups of multiples that are the same, and they're in the multiplication families. So you can use the shortcuts that I'm about to go over with you, okay, to make these denominators the same instead of going through step 1, step 2, and step 3. You can do this mentally, but you have to be very careful because you have to work out your problems. And remember, not all mental math is correct. You have to put it on paper and you need to check it twice just to make sure you have the correct information. So I'm going to take a problem from your worksheet and we're going to add 1/4 plus 1/2. Now, we can go through all the steps, but what I want you to look at is looking at these two fractions. I know that 2 and 4 are not the same, but I know that 2 and 4 are related. And so here's shortcut number 1. Now, how could I rewrite 1/4 plus 1/2? Well, I'm thinking, what fraction denominator can I use that is related to both 2 and 4? Well, I can do one of two things. I can either use one of these two as my denominators, and I can look at them and say, well, if I put 2 as my denominator, would it work? Well, no, because there's nothing times 4 that would equal 2. Could I use 4 as my denominator? Yes, because 4 is a multiple of 2, and 4 is a multiple of 4. So could I use one of these two as my denominators off the bat without having to list the least common multiples? Yes, you can. I can use 4. So I would rewrite my fractions using 4 as my least common multiple. Now here, I just got to change these fractions into related fractions with the same denominator. So I do the multiplication of one fraction to another, and that will help me create my new fractions. What times 2 is 4? 2. Whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top. So I get 2/4. 1/2 is related to 2/4. And we know that because when we simplify, everything that is every numerator that's half of the denominator will always equal 1/2. Remember that. Here, 4 times what would give me 4? 1. So that means that I'm going to keep this fraction the same. That means that 1/4, okay, is obviously related to 1/4, and 2/4 is related to 1/2. So here, now I add them because I am adding the same fraction, just using different denominators. 4 stays the same. I keep my denominator, add my numerators, and this is my final answer. Now, another way of doing this would be 1/4 over 1/2. I'm using the same one so that you can see it. Now here, my second shortcut would be to multiply the denominators. Because if you multiply them, you already know that that number that you get is going to be in the multiples list. So 2 times 4 is 8. I'm going to use 8 as my new common denominator. What times 2 is 8? 4. So there is something times 2 that equals 8. Whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. What times 4 is 2? So that's how they're related. Whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. And now I bring down my numerator that I'm going to keep. I add my denominators. And now these answers are not the same because we're missing one more step here. Anytime a fraction shares a number that it can be divided by, you must simplify it. You need to put it in its simplest form. And when you do that, you break it down to its smallest fraction, okay? The easiest fraction you can break it down to, and it's gonna equal 3/4. That's why these answers are different, because this is not in simplest form. And that's why in this lesson, I ask you to use least common multiple so that you don't have to do all that dividing, okay? Remember that this is gonna get you to the simplest fraction. This and this sometimes will not. You're gonna have to simplify at the end. So here, 6/8, how can I simplify it? Well, one number is divisible by both 6 and 8. If you thought 2, you are correct. 6 divided by 2 and 8 divided by 2, it has to be the same number, remember that, will give me 3/4. And now I am done. Remember that you have to go back into your notebook, or you can, I'm gonna add another YouTube video in finding common denominators. You can add and subtract fractions without a common denominator. And you need to find that common denominator by using related fractions, related multiples, and following your steps. So remember that adding and subtracting fractions, you have to add fractions with the same denominator, or you cannot add them. And remember, when you get to the answer, your final answer is the simplest form of the fraction. So if you get to a number that you see is related, okay, and say, you know what, I know I can divide 6 and I know I can divide 8 by the same number, that means I can simplify. If you can't find a number that both the numerator and the denominator can be divided by, then it's already in its simplest form. I'm gonna do one more for you, okay? And I'm gonna do it on the next page, and we're gonna subtract this time. So we're gonna be subtracting, okay? We're gonna subtract 6/8 minus 1/2. Now again, I don't have a common denominator. So I can do 3 things. I can find my least common multiple. So I'm gonna go over here. I'm gonna list 8 and 2. So my multiples of 8 are 8, 16, 24, 32, and 40. I always stop at 5 numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here I have 2, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. Now, I have my least common multiple here and my least common multiple here. This is a little bit longer, but it confirms the shortcut. If I said, well, you know what, I'm going to use, which number can I use out of these two to rewrite new fractions? I know I can't use 2 because nothing times 8 equals 2. So I know I can use 8, and that confirms it here. Now, if I multiply 2 times 8 and I get 16, 16 is here, but it's not here until you keep going with your multiples. But it is a common multiple, but it's larger. So that means that when you get to your final answer, you're gonna have to divide to simplify. So that's why I don't usually multiply numbers. I either use one of these two or find the least common multiple. So here I follow my steps. I found my least common multiple. I rewrote my fractions one on top of the other. I rewrote my new fractions with a new denominator. And now here I'm gonna find how they're related by using multiplication. 2 times what equals 8? That's 4. So I do the same thing to the top. That's 4 here. What times 8 is 8? 1. So that means I'm going to keep this same one, which will happen a lot. Okay? And here, I'm just going to subtract. Keep my denominator. Subtract my numerator. 6 minus 4 is 2. Now, I see that this is 2/8.